Thank you, Jordan. That was great. On behalf of the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, I want to welcome everybody here to Stamp Out Old Barn Loss, gathering on barn history and preservation trends. I'm Lorraine Merrill, and I am the moderator this afternoon. I will be introducing our wonderful panel. I'm a farmer and a writer and was New Hampshire Commissioner of Agriculture, Markets, and Food for 10 years. And I am especially, barns are wonderful. Barns are special to me. My 4 sisters and I and our 4 cousins all grew up on a multi-generational farm. And you know, I remember our friends' parents often chastising them with words like, close the door. Were you raised in a barn? But you know, we never heard that expression from our parents. And I have to say, I'm grateful that we all spent so much of our childhood and youth in barns. I want to thank Jordan Tyrrell Wysocki for that perfect keynote, literally keynotes for us. And we will be hearing more from him later. His music reminds us all of the lively activity associated with barns, of the deep cultural and artistic connections between people and barns. This barn stamp celebration is presented by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, jointly with our fellow statewide preservation nonprofits from nearly all the northeastern states today. 7 other northeastern states. So we have Maine Preservation, Preservation Connecticut, Preservation League of New York State, Preservation Massachusetts, Preservation Pennsylvania, Preserve Rhode Island, and Preservation Trust of Vermont. We're here to celebrate the U.S. Postal Service's introduction today of this wonderful set of 4 historic barns stamps. They're postcard stamps. And we really appreciate, I think all of us preservation organizations appreciate the U.S. Postal Service bringing this national attention to the broad appeal of these icons of our agrarian heritage, of hard work and community, and the work of our organizations to help prevent their loss. We thank the National Barn Alliance, the co-sponsor of this program, for really helping to spark the creation of these stamps with the Postal Service. Now, a bit on logistics before we get started. We invite you to try to use the chat function.
We have 188 participants.
And we will try and loop in some of the trends that we're seeing in our discussion today, and we'll be inviting you to participate more extensively in the small group breakout session late at the end. So let's see, we have, and today's event is free, but we hope you'll support our nonprofit organizations to help us do more for old barns and to help save other special places in our states. When you'll be watching for your email box, because there will be a follow-up email that has the links to all of our organizations that are participating today and additional resources. Um, so I would like to introduce our featured panelists today. In addition to our award-winning fiddler, we also have 3 nationally known barn experts. All 3 of them have written classic award-winning books on this field. We have Thomas Hubka, author of Big House, Little House, Back House Barn, The Connected Farm Buildings of New England. He is a professor emeritus in the Department of Architecture at the School of Architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He specializes on the connections between architecture and buildings and culture and people. His newest book is How the Working Class Home Became Modern from 1900 to 1940. John Porter, a UNH Extension professor emeritus, was University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension dairy specialist for 30 years, and he continues to advise farmers on structures and farmstead planning. He is co-author of Preserving Old Barns, Preventing the Loss of a Valuable Resource. Thomas D. Visser is professor of historic preservation and directs the Graduate Historic Preservation Program at the University of Vermont. His publications include The Field Guide to New England Barns and Farm Buildings and Porches of North America. Tom assisted the U.S. Postal Service with the design and authentication of the 4 historic barns depicted on these new stamps that we are celebrating. So, to begin, I guess, Tom Hubka, start with you. What got you interested in old barns and barn preservation?
Almost exactly 50 years ago, my brother and I bought a fallen down connected farm in Bridgeton, Maine. I had done architecture in that area previously. So half a century ago, we bought the place and started to fix it up and preserve it. So it's been 50 years of doing that. I've been coming back to New England for 50 years, almost every year for 50 years, and looking at great barns and houses. It's been a joy.
Well, it's I have to say your book, I love the title of your book. I think it's like a poem, you know, it's
Well, it's a poem that came from the
that's why.
local,
Yeah, okay.
local folks, but children particularly, I would say. A farmer would never describe the building that way ever, but children did, and yeah. I think that's what I tried to record.
Well, that's
great.
It is great. It is indeed. John Porter.
Well, I grew up on a dairy farm in Lebanon, New Hampshire. I tell people I probably spent more of my growing up days in the daytime in a barn than I did a house. After my sophomore year of college, my father decided to revamp the barn, and the contractor didn't know much about barns, but he said he would do it if one of us would work with him. So my father relieved me of my haymaking duties, and I worked with a contractor all summer revamping our barn. And then in '74, I was hired back into New Hampshire as a dairy specialist, about the time farmers were transferring from tie stall to free stalls. And I was involved a lot with helping farmers use their old barns, renovate their barns, and so forth. And then in 1999, the barn committee was started in New Hampshire. And my supervisor, Bruce Marriott, was a member. I wasn't. And one night he called me at home and he said, I was at the barn committee today, and they said they need a book written about New Hampshire barns. I raised my hand. I said, you would write it. And he said, you ought to ask your coworker, Francis Gilman, to help you. So 2001, I wrote Preserving Old Barns. And then by 2015, we're running out of copies. And so Francis and I started working. We brought in Lowell Fuster, had some help from Aaron Sturgis, and finally published our newest edition of Preserving Old Barns in 2019. So it's been quite a ride, quite a change of career for me, brought me into a whole lot of different groups of people, and it's just been a great thing.
Well, it's you've brought immeasurably to all of us in New Hampshire and well beyond as a result of that. Tom Visser, let's ask you a different question to start with. Can you share with us something of about barn styles or construction that you've observed from all of your work, your field work, and that you think might be of interest to our audience?
Well, absolutely. And thank you for the invitation here. It's great to see everybody. To put this into context, I'm just going to jump back a little bit, and you're asking about the inspiration.
So that's, yeah.
Okay. In 1986, my parents gave me this book. Okay.
Oh, that
I
is
was
so
just
cool.
finishing up graduate school, and I grew up in Carroll County, New Hampshire. We had a barn. If we weren't in the house, we were in the barn. Okay. Worked on a farm all through high school. So the barn is in my blood. And then coming out of graduate school, I was hired at the University of Vermont to teach and do consulting. And I wanted to write a book about barns. It was just in me. It had to come out. So this sort of led to this exploration of barns. And what I realized at that time was Tom Hubka's book was the foundation, because it focused on the fabric, if you will, of the barns. It was not one of these nice coffee table picture books. There are many of them and they're wonderful, but it focused on the history. And I figured that I wanted to do that too. And by combining the studies in historic preservation, it really came to looking at the physical evidence to be able to decipher the history, because so often we don't have that written history about the barns. It's not like we might have for so many other buildings, the
Yes.
stores, the houses, and so on. For the barns, it's often that physical evidence. So it's the nails, it's the saw marks, and then it's also folding in the history of agriculture and looking at that physical evidence. So this is then sort of the start. And it was several years. I got a nice grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to drive around New England, and from Aroostook County to Rhode Island to Connecticut, just talking to farmers about their barns. I learned so much more in the field talking to barn owners than I could have possibly learned through any other, more reading a book. So anyway, I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. There's we're seeing some threads here already for sure. So Tom Hubka, come back to you. Is there something that you would share with our audience that you've picked up in your all the years and barn visits that you've made?
We don't have enough time for that.
Pick one.
I think unique to New England, I've studied the Connected Farm Organization primarily, so it's house and barn that I've primarily studied. But interesting and unlike any other place that we know, the farmers of northern New England primarily ornamented their barns with the same architectural style as their house, and to create a unified ensemble, a little bit. The same detail wasn't exact, but somewhat. In other places of the country, they fixed up their houses and their barns, but they didn't do that. They didn't. They put different things on their barns and made them red and then the house white and things like that. So interestingly, there is a commitment to preserving and creating this unified complex in some ways. I don't get too overdone with the aesthetics here, but this house to barn, this unity of fixing it up. And I think during the late 19th century, they did that primarily. And so that's why we have these great buildings. And so there's detail there that is associated with your house. Maybe you have a barn usually. And that's pretty exciting, I think.
It is. I think people have taken a lot of pride in their farmsteads, their whole, as you say, the whole complex, if you will. A farm is often like a little village, and you see that.
Especially nice word, village. The amount of outbuildings along with
Yes.
the major barn. We're talking about the barn, but along with New England's architecture is a whole squadron of related smaller sugar houses and sheep barns and milk sheds and things like that. And other places have that, but not so much. And it's because New Hampshire and New England farmers had to diversify so much. And so that history is there. And so with our preservation effort, I was hoping to emphasize the preservation and rehabilitation of smaller agricultural buildings that may look like, fallen down sheds and things like that. But they're very much part of the history of farmsteads, and they record the diversification of farming that was thrust on New Hampshire farmers, and they responded.
Right. And I'm glad to say our New Hampshire programs to help with farm barn conservation and preservation include other agricultural buildings as well. Yes. That's great. John Porter, tell us one thing about repair or stewardship of old barns that you think is especially important.
Well, I'm famous for going to somebody's place and condemning all the vegetation that's around their buildings. And I say that probably half of the problems on barns is caused by vegetation next to the buildings. The trees brush the roof, they scrape the side, the roots go into the cellar and so forth. And so I'm a real advocate about cleaning away the brush and also doing just contouring of the soil around the buildings for natural drainage, because a lot of times there's water running through the basements, and without getting into tiling and a whole lot of things, you can just contour. So I've been known for condemning Aunt Lily's lilacs quite a few times and said they gotta go. In fact, if there's a gentleman listening in the Durham area, I went to his barn, I said, you gotta clean the trees out. And he brought in a professional tree surgeon, and what a difference. It opens it up, it shows it off, it dries it out, and it would buy a lot more years by getting the vegetation away. So I'm a real stickler on that.
And I've accompanied you on a few barn tours where you've been giving that very advice to the owners. But it's so true, so true. Let's see, Tom Visser, how about you? Would you have another particular hint in terms of maintenance, repair, preservation?
Sure. Having also looked at a good number of barns over the years, and especially starting out my career, I received a lot of support from the Preservation Trust of Vermont and many other organizations to help provide technical assistance to barn owners. And I think one thing that really struck more often than not was that, sure, we do have barns that are actively serving farming needs, but we also have a huge number of older barns that are perhaps, not so actively serving agriculture and farming needs. And to make the case for their preservation, we often want to start by asking, actually, what are they being used for? And it's almost like 90% of the time they're being used for storage. And they work very well for that. People say, oh, I want to tear down the barn because we don't need it anymore. I say, well, okay, what about the snowblower? What about this? What about that? What are you going to do? Oh, okay. And so I think, sort of understanding that it is, whether it's a chicken coop or a dairy barn, these may have adaptive reuses out there. And that often the other issue is people say, oh, well, to preserve it, we need to make a big plan, we need to make a huge investment. Indeed, sometimes one does. But if there is any way to do this incrementally, as John is just mentioning, let the building breathe, then identify those areas of active deterioration. Is there a roof leak? Is there a rotten sill that's putting an enormous amount of stress on the structure that, some simple jacking or whatever could help to maintain this building for a long time. So I really do like to sort of encourage people to think about steps that can be taken to sustain that building, and not necessarily need to come up with this big plan and a lot of money to do it from one end to the other.
Yes, and that's one of our more popular programs at the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance is the barn grants, small grants to help people get some consultation to evaluate their barns and do exactly that and develop a plan. Yes, that's excellent. So back to Tom Hubka again. Let's see. Tom, what do you worry about most, with the threat to these barns and other agricultural buildings?
I'll try to tie this in with the maintenance of barn question that we just answered. I preach about barns. Preserve the roof. If you want to do anything about your structure that will preserve it, I think the roof is the key element to that. It's because the nature of barn construction, the older barns of Morris and Tenon construction, it's strong, it'll last hundreds of years, but if it gets wet, it's not going to last very long. And even to the point of put something on the roof that'll preserve it for the next generation. And if you do that, it will aesthetically, there's some issues, and I recommend metal roofing. And for some, that's it breaks visual codes or whatever it was. But there's no question that there's hundreds of thousands of agricultural structures that can be preserved by simply putting roofing on it, by metal roofing. I'd recommend a kind of a ridged steel type product. I mean, there's aluminum and there's standing seam, other kinds of metals too, and they can be debated. But by preserving a roof, you preserve the barn, and by not doing that, we can go into whether the foundation comes next or whatever it was, but the roof, and you can encourage your neighbor to do that. Your neighbor has it, well, just the roof, and it isn't a $1,000, a $100,000 project. So a good roof can be put on a couple $1,000, but it needs. This is not a do-it-yourself project. So for any of you home remodelers out there, putting even a temporary metal roof. Aesthetically, they got some issues that you want to talk about, but I would asphalt shingles. They're about 3 times as heavy as most metal roofs. A vulnerable structure will be endangered because of a heavy roof and then snow load. So. I want to preserve every agricultural structure I can, and a good roof will do that. And I would emphasize that. I hope that answers.
Good. John, how about you? What do you worry about most about these old structures around the countryside?
Well, I worry because a lot of them are owned by widow ladies that their husbands passed away, or maybe it was in their husband's family. I've literally had crying ladies on the phone saying, I just don't know what to do. This has been in the family 100 years and I'm on Social Security and it needs a lot of work. And so a lot of these are owned by older folks that just can't see their way clear financially to do all that needs to be done. So I'm really concerned about people being able to keep up with these that have limited income, but have the love for the barn, but just don't have the means to do what they like to do.
Yes, that is a challenge, and there are not as many ways of helping people like that as we might wish for. There are, we have the tax programs where if a town votes to participate, the taxes won't go up when you have the make improvements like that. But it seems like it would be great to have more easement kinds of programs, historic preservation easements on some of these barns so that people could get some money to help pay for it, isn't it? Let's see, Tom Visser. You know these stamps. Probably you and the artist, whoever it is,
Well,
tell us about the barns that are featured in these 4 stamps. I don't think there's any New England barns, but they're regional, aren't they?
yeah. Well, let me just say, just to build on what John Porter was just talking about, I hope in the breakout sessions, there may be the opportunity sort of on the statewide level to hear about some of the opportunities and grants and so on that may be available to help some of the people who are in those situations, because certainly some states have put together some barn grant programs, and I think it's an effort, and it's making a difference. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that. The stamps, I was asked by a consulting firm who was working with the U.S. Postal Service to provide some kind of, shall we say, expert review of the artwork that was being submitted for those stamps. I was not the artist, but the whole challenge here, and this is what it is. The challenge was to have 4 illustrations that were representative of barns that no barn could be identified as a specific barn. So it had to be generic, but then again, it had to be accurate. So, I mean, and it couldn't be a cartoon. so again, it's just this matter of, okay, should there be a great big cupola on a 4-bay barn? Well, most of the surviving examples that are good, that are in the Library of Congress, HABs, etc., do not have those. Maybe they would have been added later. So we went through this kind of analytical process for each one of those drawings. Some was just little tweaking, little thing. Okay, we need a door on the side. I mean, little things like that. But, it was almost a year of just going back and forth with the artist to just try to make it as accurate as possible without being a specific barn. So that was it. And as with many things in government, of course, there was a gag order, and I was prohibited from talking about the project until I just learned about it a month or so ago. And that's where I shared the news with Jennifer and everybody. And it's so great that you're all here today to celebrate this. It really is.
Do you want to tell us about some of the specifics of what the barns are, what they represent, or?
Gee, I'd have to look at
I don't know, the styles or.
I mean, there's a Western barn.
Yeah,
and that one, we started out, that was quite good. It, and the artist did a wonderful job on all of these. And so it was just sort of tweaking some things. Let's see. There's a round barn. And of course, the round barn needs to have a cupola on it. And it did. And, because of the age and so on, typically these round barns are late 19th century, early 20th century. So it was sort of in keeping with those. As I mentioned, the 4-bay barn, typically in Pennsylvania, has certain characteristics that are reflected there. And then the 4th barn is a bit more generic. I mean, it's sort of a barn that I think was intended to could be a barn found in New England or Wisconsin or wherever. I think that was kind of the goal here.
And there is also a seasonal theme. Each of the 4 barns is depicted in a different season of the year, right?
That's it.
So, which is appropriate to agriculture, of course, too.
Some of you may not know this, but New Hampshire was the forerunner in developing the first barn stamp. I went through a website, took a photo of a barn up north, got approval, and we used these for a fundraiser. We made 200. I have 2 left, but New Hampshire was first on the block.
Yes, thank you for reminding us of that, John. That's cool. Okay, so let's see. I think we're back to Tom Hubka again, aren't we? Tom, what gives you, and we talked a little bit about what we worry about. What gives you hope for all these historic barns and agricultural structures around?
Basic decency of most people. I don't think we have to, in many cases in New England, overemphasize the desirability of preserving older structures. There are areas of the country or people that preservation is a little more difficult, but I think there's a rootedness about a love of our forebears or ancestors and things like that. No different from other parts, but there's a deepness here that has to do with preserving the buildings. So that's easy, I think, to water. I think recognizing local efforts is really important. Compliment your neighbor when they fix things up. Local pictures in the paper about someone who's fixed up the old sheds. That's word of mouth, but it requires, I think, watering and sustaining that. Also, there's another aspect of recognizing good contractors, the people who do this.
Yes.
Contractors, they get a lot of hits lots of times for interesting reasons, but there's a whole depth of New England contractors who work on barns. By the way, if you're doing preservation work or preserving a barn, I think experience counts. So don't get a new house construction contractor. My brother's a contractor, and I'm an architect that I deal with them all my life. So we should recognize the contribution of good contractors and get a bid, get someone who's done the work before, and that will help immeasurably. Good people.
You're right. We are fortunate. We have contractors who truly love these old buildings and have the skills that
Find one of those
are needed. Yeah. They're in demand. John Porter, do you see trends? I mean, to me, it seems like these buildings are more valued now than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, that there was a time when they were viewed more as white elephants or liabilities. And now I think that whether you're talking people on farms or non-farm neighbors and so forth, there's a renewed appreciation for these buildings. Do you think, or am I imagining that?
Well, I like to think that our educational efforts are working, because if somebody calls me and they're contemplating taking a barn down, the first thing they do is apologize. They'll say, no, I know I really ought to have this. I know it's special. I don't have the money or whatever. Or even if a neighbor starts thinking about tearing down a barn, another neighbor might go over and say, boy, the state's really concerned about their barns now. And I just think there's a consciousness now. Everybody kind of stops a second and thinks before they tear them down. And I like to think it's maybe the result of the efforts that all these different groups have been doing and getting information out, that there's a pause, I think, before people tear down barns. So I think that's been really encouraging.
Yes. Does that give you hope? Is that?
Yeah, it does. And the other thing it gives me hope is, I know during COVID, we're sort of a little scared about all these out-of-staters coming in, but some of them are buying up old farmsteads with an old barn on it, and they like the barn and they have the means to fix it. I've gotten several calls from multimillionaires that have bought country places, and boy, they're focusing right on that barn. It's a high priority. They want it fixed, and they have the means to do it. They don't even bat an eyelash. So we've got some people coming in with money, capturing some of these places and fixing them. I visited several this winter.
Yeah, so it's an interesting phenomenon that's happening. Yeah. Also, do you think you see more new uses of barns for operating farms as well? I mean, I think some of the agritourism and more direct marketing enterprises are finding ways to use these barns.
I think so. Like when I get a visit and somebody talks about putting animals in barns, I discourage them. That's kind of ironic because these barns were built for animals. But I'll say, maybe you're better to build a pole barn for your Hereford cattle, but use your old barn for the hay and for your country store or your farm stand or whatever. And so I think a lot of folks are being very creative in making these into their farm stores. And customers love to come in and just look
Yes.
around and look at the ceilings and the beams and everything. And we've got many examples of very beautiful country stores and farm stands that are utilizing the old barn, but put the animals maybe in a newer structure and don't, have the water and the urine, the water, deteriorate the barn.
Yes. That's Tom Visser. What gives you hope? Do you see some, that
Absolutely,
it's not
yeah.
all falling down barns and disappearing,
No.
disintegrating?
I think one of the kind of aha moments, the eye-opening, awakening, and all of that that happened when I was doing the research and certainly when doing the consulting as well, was this fundamental understanding that many of our older barns in New England in particular, but also New York, Pennsylvania, to a certain degree in the Midwest and other parts of the country, many of our older barns became functionally obsolete 100 years ago. And as like John is saying, whether it was a sheep barn or whatever, nevertheless, they were adapted, and they have been adapted on and on and on. Just before we all came on here, we were talking about the adaptations of a barn in Vermont with at least 3 stories of its history there as physical evidence. And I think the way that these older farm buildings can tell the story of our heritage resonates. And I think it obviously can involve some education, and to let the people that may be in a position of responsibility to know that what they have is valued broadly. I think that can help. I mean, certainly in these uncertain times, the trend we're hearing about for people to maybe come another back to the land movement, so on, is something hopeful. And I think because these older barns often were smaller structures, they are more adaptable. To be sure, we've got those engineered truss barns from the 1930s and 40s that are big barns, and maybe they're going to be best used for storing hay or whatever. But I think particularly the smaller barns that are on homesteads that contribute so much to the character of places really do have a value that extends to the community, to the state, and to the identity of rural places. Yes,
thank you. I think for all 3 of you, in terms of hope, and we've all spoken of how much of our childhoods or young years were spent in barns and exploring barns and working in barns, and the generational transition is crucial for all kinds of farms and buildings that go with them. And what do you think in terms of the younger generation trying to acquire ownership in these farm properties and be able to support and maintain these buildings? Any thoughts? And really, all 3 of you can just jump in. Who wants to tackle it?
One concern I'd have is, it doesn't seem like young people have an appreciation for older things. I think we're kind of skipping a generation a little bit, and I hope they'll come along. I think our middle-aged folks, I think, are with us, but it seems like young people want an energy-efficient home and free weekends to go to the lake. And I'm a little concerned about that generation picking up on these structures.
I just stopped educating young people most of my life. I'm eternally optimistic about future generations. Oh, by the way, I grew up on Blacktop in Jersey, so
Yeah.
the barn appreciation. And because of that, I
bought
think that inoculating new younger people with the love of the farming ways of New England, education is important. So locally preserving good history of local peoples, supporting that in some ways, I think is all part of creating a context for preserving any kind of structure. So I preach the preservation of modest houses and barns, especially, and that requires, I think, sensitively looking at modest history. Whole movement of Black history, looking at slave quarters. Well, now we can do that. Now it's okay. We can look at the big house as we always done, but we can also look at the slave quarters too. As we could in New England, we can also look at lots of generations of how people have used the land and buildings, and even modest ones. And that requires, I think, good history too. So,
and we can all encourage young people to get involved. I know in our town we have a young farmer in her 20s who's become a very active member of our local heritage commission, for example. And there's sometimes we need to do that more. I think those of us in the senior generations need to sort of collar more of the young people and get them into things like that. Tom Visser, what do you got?
One thing that kind of combines both of these topics about optimism, and I think we're talking a little bit about generations and so on, is how the sort of a very typical profile of graduate students who have been studying with us at the University of Vermont in historic preservation have typically been in their mid to late 20s or early 30s. And often they have a deep sense of history and a connection with places, and have that interest in really kind of combining the past with the future and looking for ways to adapt but still respect. And I think this is certainly an area of optimism. I think, and again, I mean, having visited with many families when doing research, and in those years when I was doing consulting, there was often this profile where the older generation, perhaps the grandparents, really loved their barns. It was tied to memory. But the next generation that is worrying about the day-to-day cash flow, hey, we've got to get something that's going to work. And that old thing is going to cost us money, so let's put up a new pole barn or whatever. And so it was rather interesting often to be able to sort of provide some support for those who felt it was important to save the old barn, for those kitchen table conversations, I'm sure that will go on. So I think as a community, whatever we can do to provide that kind of education, support, not guilt tripping, but creative enthusiasm and pointing to opportunities and through examples and so on. I really hope that that's a direction that we can all strive for.
I see a lot of young people involved in agriculture that are particularly interested in interacting with the public, educating people, inviting them to the farm. And I think that those our historic structures can play an important role in all of that. Now, all of you here today in our audience, you've been really contributing a lot in the chat sphere. And I wanted to call on Beverly Thomas, who is program director with New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, who's been monitoring all this. Beverly, are you there? Can identify a couple of trends or things that you might point out to us?
Well, I had to smile when, after John was commenting on young people, how many people chimed in about, hey, wait, I'm out here preserving my barn. So there are a bunch of young folks here today, and I want to thank them for their participation and for what they're doing with their barns. And I run the barn program at the Preservation Alliance, and I must say that I have a lot of people contacting me that are under 30 that are buying old farmsteads and using them and their barns for some kind of agriculture. So it's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, it's expensive for them. And what we do is we try to encourage, you don't have to fix the whole thing at once. You know, do it in baby steps. If that's fine. As Tom Hubka says, keep a good roof on and that'll buy you multiple years. But anyway, there are a lot of folks, actually, including my daughter, bought a big farm in Vermont with a huge round barn. So it's great to see. I love to see it. So that was the most popular response to anything in the chat. But other than that, folks wanted to know about resources, and depending on where you are in the country, I would suggest reaching out to your statewide nonprofit, preservation nonprofit, if you have one, the State Historic Preservation Office. And then there are smaller local preservation organizations around. If there's not a statewide, there are certainly other preservation organizations around. We have great resources on our website. I know Vermont does too, and all the other northeastern states. I'm not as familiar with the Midwest and the Western states, but there's a lot of information online that you can find. And as somebody pointed out, barn contractors are a great resource, and quite often, I know the ones in New Hampshire are on our list, we have a list, are more than happy to talk to you on the phone if you have a specific issue that you're worried about. Okay, so that's another great resource. What else? I don't know how much time we have, a couple more minutes maybe.
Yeah, get another minute or two.
Yeah, I wanted to thank the person that asked about the stamp, and someone responded with a link to I guess it's a postal service, and who the artist was. So that was great. Thank you for that. Changes in farming practices, and I think we touched on that a little bit, how some of these older barns aren't really good for modern farming practices. And I think John talks about that a little bit in his book, how you can adjust and change your barn for your current practices. And someone asked about the books. The book, you can get these books on our website, but I know each of the authors also, I don't know if you want to just real quickly, actually, I guess what we'll do is we'll put that in our post-event communication. Yep. Oh, look at this. Everybody hold up their books.
I should have brought my book.
Excellent. Right. And Lorraine too. So, but we'll make sure we put that. Oh, thank you, everybody. Make sure we put links in the post-event communication. Okay, so that's it for now, Lorraine. Thank you very much.
That's great. I think just all the chat comments and responses from within the group are some valuable material there, and I think it will help us with future programming and topics and things too. So I thank everybody for being so actively participating here. Now it's time for me to introduce Jordan again. We promised you that we would hear from him a little more. Jordan is also a native of New Hampshire, a musician and composer who grew up with traditional contra dance and Celtic music. And Jordan, are you ready? First, before you play again, what do old barns mean to you? And how is it different playing your music in an old barn compared to, a hotel or a community center venue?
Good question. Yeah, thanks for asking. So it is quite different actually, and it's really wonderful, mainly because of the community connection that you have playing in a barn. There are certainly times when it's nice to play in a state-of-the-art large venue with a stage and fancy lights and a backstage area and green room. I mean, that can be really nice in some settings, but when you don't have that, what you get instead is a much closer connection with the people that you're performing for. It really changes the nature of the relationship between the performer and the audience. If you're on the same level instead of up on a stage, if you're lit by the same light that's lighting everyone else and you can see them as well as they can see you, there's no green room to go hide in. You're right there with the crowd, and that's a really organic and really wonderful environment to perform in a lot of ways. There's also oftentimes the type of show that you're playing. Instead of playing a concert in a barn, you might be playing a barn dance or a contra dance, a square dance. I would imagine that a lot of you barn enthusiasts are familiar with what I'm talking about, but that's a tradition here in New England and New Hampshire that's a really big deal, and it's where I got my start in fiddling. So I first was exposed to this music at an old time barn dance, and that's where I met my first fiddle teacher. I can distinctly remember playing in a lot of barns as a kid, long before I was any good and had any business performing. The community was sort of welcoming me in and allowing me to play at dances and barns, and that's really what it comes down to for me, is the community connection you get from that sort of environment.
Well, thank you. Now, what are you going to play for us?
I think I'm going to do 2 short pieces, if we still have time for that.
Yep.
I'm going to start with a slow piece. A lot of the performing that I do nowadays in barns is for weddings. I'm sure you're all aware of how many people want to get married in a barn, and so oftentimes when they do that, they want a old time fiddler as the soundtrack. And so this is the type of piece that I would often be playing for a ceremony or cocktail hour or something like that in a barn. This is called Charlie Murray's Waltz. And actually, give me 1 second. I'm going to turn off my heater so the sound quality is better. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. It was off for an hour, and then right when I need it, it kicks on. So there's the an example of a slower piece. Thank you. I see people.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I'm just going to do a one from the other end of the spectrum. This is just a good old-fashioned tune. It's called St. Anne's Reel. I've heard it claimed by French-Canadian fiddlers and Scottish fiddlers and Irish fiddlers. And the thing is, wherever it came from originally, hardly matters anymore, because it ended up here in New England, where it all those traditions meshed together. And this is played at just about every barn dance I've ever been to. So a good old timey tune here. much.
Oh, thank you. Jordan, that was perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I think, and people, the audience has gone wild with all their compliments here. So that's just super. So I want to thank Jordan and each and every one of our panelists. This has just been, I think, a wonderful program. You can find their books at the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance online store, as well as other places. And Jordan, we'll put your website on our follow-up email too, right? So
Great.
that people can want to look you up, will be able to. And let's see. So you can also remember to ask for the new stamps at your post office. And I just want to say it's the engagement and support of folks like the nearly 600 people we have participating today, that gives us hope, you know, for our historic farm buildings and really our communities preserving our agrarian heritage and ensuring that we have a sustainable future as well. And we appreciate all that so many of you are doing for Barnes and our agricultural heritage in your communities and your states across the region and the country. Now, we're going to be exploring these important themes further in our state gatherings. Our technical wizard, the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance's Nicole Flynn, is going to move us like magic into our respective breakout sessions, which are organized by state. You'll be automatically placed in the breakout session that you signed up for when you registered. Do watch your email boxes in this next week for the follow-up information that will be coming. And I want to thank our wonderful fiddler and our 3 guest authors for sharing so generously their experience. And Nicole, take us away.